words I speak and the words we hear be your words of life to us, our God. Amen.
Amen.
So clearly, I'm not from America, from New Zealand, which means I don't speak American. I speak New Zealand, and that means three things. First is, I speak too fast, I swallow my vowels, and I will use words that you will not understand, just as you use words that I don't understand. So if that happens and you don't understand what I'm saying, just put up your hand and I'll get Ken to translate. It's great to be with you this morning. A surprise, but it is good. Yesterday, Ken was in his swimming pool and his lounger, fast asleep, and I was inside reading stuff about Luke. So I put up on Facebook page a picture of him in a swimming pool and me grafting inside so that I could be at his church today. But it's a privilege. It's great to be here. Over the last few years, 8 or 9 years, most of my ministry has been in youth ministry, but about nearly 8 years ago I became a parish priest. So I have been a priest for a very long time. But I've kind of gone into parish ministry, which is a blessing. It's been a great joy. I'm glad I did all those years of youth ministry, but I'm glad I'm doing parish ministry now. And a lot of what I've been trying to do has been built around three questions. Whose are we? Who are we? And what is ours to do? That last question is a particularly Franciscan question. Whose are we? Who are we? And what is ours to do? That first question, whose are we, is all about how do we understand God? Who is God for us? Ken and I yesterday were talking about the prayer of humble access, which talks about we're sinners, but I can't remember the words now. But you are the God whose nature is always to have mercy. And I remember as a young boy sitting in church, kind of your guys' age, thinking, how do we know God's nature is always to have mercy? How do we, maybe God is just a grumpy old man and wants to smite us. This seems a little bit presumptuous. Well, as a Franciscan, I would say the answer to that question is found in the Gospels. For us, God is revealed in the incarnate Word who came among us in the person of Jesus. And one of the problems with the Reformation is the Jesus event kind of got sandwiched into Jesus died for our sins so we can go to heaven. And the rest of the Gospels kind of got forgotten apart from little pithy sayings that we might use every now and again. But actually the Gospel writers wrote those whole stories for a reason. If it was just about the death and resurrection, they wouldn't have bothered. In fact, if it was just about the death and resurrection, Mark really stuffed it up because, am I allowed to say that here? He really made a mess of it because his resurrection is about one line. And he hardly mentions it. I mean, it's really important for him, but he didn't make a big deal of it. So when those gospel writers wrote their gospels, they were writing not stories about Jesus, they weren't writing histories, they weren't writing biographies, they were writing theology. And they used the stories of Jesus to write theology. And the theology was, in Jesus we meet God. That's the point. We know the nature of God when we read the Gospels because everything that Jesus does represents to us, lives out for us the nature of God. Now this morning we had a reading, and in fact all this year we have readings from Luke's Gospel, Year C. And I love Year C because Luke is a great Gospel. It has great stories. The parable of the Good Samaritan, which is it's a brutal story if we're honest about it, should really challenge us. And there's the story of the prodigal son, which is not the best name for it. It's probably, I think a better name is the story of the unfinished story of the father who had two sons. So the story actually isn't finished. Now all of Luke's Gospel can be seen to be a kind of explication, there's a better word for that, a description or a drawing out of Luke 4 verse 16. So who knows what Luke 4 verse 16 says? Anyone? Going to give it a guess? Ken does, because he was here at 8 o'clock. Maybe he's forgotten already. So that's when Jesus is in the synagogue in Nazareth, just before they try to chuck him off a hill. And Jesus reads from the scroll of Isaiah, a little bit further on from the reading we heard this morning from Isaiah, where he talks about bringing good news to the poor, proclaiming release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, setting the oppressed free, and proclaiming the year of the Lord's favour. Now that is a summary for Luke of what Jesus is on about, which means it's a summary of God and God's action in the world. God is a God who brings good news to the poor. God is a God who proclaims release to the captives. God is a God who offers recovery of sight to the blind, who sets the oppressed free and proclaims the year of the Lord's favour. If you want to see where God is active in the world, that's where you look. Where good news has been offered to the poor, where release has been offered to captives, etc. You get it, I'm sure. And this story is all about that. So this morning's story in the Gospel, we have a woman who has been held captive for 18 years by a spirit. She's not demon-possessed, she is just held captive by the spirit. And the result of this is she is bent over. And because she is bent over in her world, that meant, well, she was invisible, but also she was ostracized. In all likelihood, she would have been removed from her family relationships and from her community. She would have lived on the edge in grinding poverty because all her economic supports would have been removed. So when Jesus says he brings good news to the poor, she is poor. She is the poorest person in that synagogue, and that is saying something. And he brings good news to her. So that's the first thing. He lives that out. And then he proclaims release for her. He releases her from the captivity of that spirit. Now, when you're bent over, I don't know if you've ever tried it, but when you're bent over like that, your world becomes that little piece around your feet. It is really hard when you're bent over to look up and to see the rest of the world. It's an effort. So your world narrows down. So she is blind to so much that is going on around her. And when he lays his hands on her, and she straightens up, she is able to see easily so much more. Up to that point, she had been oppressed, and she is freed. She is restored, in fact. She is restored by what he does and what he says to her family. She is now immersed back into that, and she is immersed back into the community. Now, if I had been reading the Gospel today, I wouldn't have stopped where Walter stopped. I would have carried on. That's where the lectionary writers tell us to stop. But if we carry on, we hear Jesus say, "This is what then is the kingdom of God like?" Still the same story. It is like a mustard seed. It is like yeast in a dough. Now, mustard seed and yeast in a dough aren't separate stories. Most of the sermons I've ever preached, most of the sermons you've ever heard, we just wax lyrical about those two things if they are unrelated to the story in Luke's Gospel of the bent-over woman. But actually, they're all about the bent-over woman. She is the mustard seed. She is the yeast. Put back. When Jesus lays his hands on her like a mustard seed, she was small and she stands up straight and becomes a place of hospitality. Like a piece of dough, yeast and dough, when she stands up, she is restored back into her community, and that will change her family and her community just because she is back in those relationships. Now, so one of my beefs about the way we read the Bible, especially the Gospels, is that we chop it up. We chop it up into little stories and we put headings on them. You know, when Luke wrote his gospel, there were no headings, there were no chapters, there weren't even verses. It was just a gospel which started at the beginning and ended at the end, and you didn't read it over a year, you read it in one sitting. You would go and join the others and you would listen to the Gospel of Luke from beginning to end. And what that does is you get a sense of how all those stories talk to each other. You get a sense of how they work with each other to present the picture that Luke is presenting of who Jesus is. I invite you sometime to just try that. Sit down and read the Gospels in one sitting, and you will see that changes how the whole thing works. They are not little discrete stories with chapter headings. Cross out the chapter headings. Half the time they're misleading anyway, whoever put them in. So, where am I up to? When we read that story, we often think that it's just the woman who is healed. It's just the woman that those things that Luke 4:16 is talking about applies to. But actually it applies to every single person who was in that synagogue. Because that synagogue was full of poor people. People at the time of Jesus were desperately poor. It's never easy to live under empire, any empire. The point of an empire is to take the wealth of the places at the outside of the empire and to move it all back into the middle to keep the empire functioning well. And so the wealth of that land was being moved back to Rome. They had taxes they had to pay for their occupying army. And then, well, they had their own kings and they had their own taxes. And there was a temple tax. They were supposed to go to Jerusalem, and every time they went to Jerusalem they had to pay a temple tax. And these people are subsistent farmers who used to have their own land and are now labourers on what was their own land. So they are poor. And Jesus in the midst of these poor people. And in many ways they are captive. I'll come back to that one. Recovery of sight for the blind. Well, they are blind because they don't see that woman in their midst. There's only one person in that story who sees that woman, and it's Jesus. No one else sees her. No one else. She is invisible to them. They are blind. And when Jesus raises her up, straightens her up, well, their sight is restored. They can now see her again. Somebody they had not seen for 18 years, even though she lived in their midst. Now, one of the things that Jesus is doing in the story is having a debate with the synagogue leader. Because the synagogue leader goes, "What are you doing? There are 6 days you can heal. The Sabbath, Shabbat, is about obeying the rules and having no work and just being in synagogue. Why are you healing this person on this day?" Now, within Judaism, they read their scriptures a little bit differently from us. Us Christians think there is one meaning for a passage, and we fight to the death and to make sure that our understanding of that passage is the one that wins. Isn't that right? We do it here, we do it in our country, we've been having fights to the death about all sorts of things. Last year I was privileged to be able to go on Good Friday to a Jewish Passover service. So I ran my 3-hour service, then I went to Hebenton. We have a lot less Jews living in New Zealand than in America or New York. And in the big cities like Wellington and Auckland, there's enough of them that they can have a progressive synagogue and an Orthodox synagogue. But if you go to a place like Hamilton, which is a smaller city, there is enough of them so they can get together, all of them. Orthodox, Reformed, Progressive, all of them. They just have to kind of make it work with all their different interpretations about what it means to be a Jew. And we had an Orthodox liturgy at that one. It was an Orthodox family that said they'd run it. And what struck me about the liturgy was, like, we have our liturgy and it's all, it's got all these nice lines and we follow it. So they would have a passage from Exodus about what the Passover was all about. And then in the liturgy, which we read out, they would have a discussion between rabbis about what that meant. Rabbi so-and-so says this. Rabbi so-and-so says this. Rabbi so-and-so says this. Rabbi so-and-so says this. 4 interpretations of what that meant. No need to say this one is the right one and this one, these others are wrong. They just said, here's 4 interpretations. I read somewhere that for Jews, when you debate Torah, Torah is like a beautiful diamond, and you look at it from one angle, and you have an intense debate. Jews do intense debates. Like if you go to Israel, even their discussion about who should get out of the taxi is an intense debate. But they will have an intense debate about looking at that piece of Torah from one point of view, and then this book said, and when they've finished that, they will turn around to look at that same piece of Torah from a different angle, and then they'll have another intense debate. Not to win each other over, but so they can have a deeper understanding about what that piece of scripture, what that piece of Torah means, because there is way more than one understanding of it. Oh, that we would do that. And that's what's happening here. So the synagogue leader is presenting one idea, and Jesus is offering another idea. So the synagogue leader is saying, you've got to obey the letter of the law. And Jesus is saying, quoting Deuteronomy, and we know it's a Deuteronomic version of the 10 Commandments, because he quotes Deuteronomy 22, when he talks about the ox, and you take the ox and your donkeys to water. That's in Deuteronomy. So the Exodus version of the 10 Commandments, Sabbath, Shabbat, is about creation. In Deuteronomy, it is about liberty. We were once slaves, and God has taken us out of slavery into the promised land. We are liberated. Sabbath, Shabbat, is a celebration of liberation. So, what are they celebrating here? Well, Jesus is saying God has been incredibly generous. And on Sabbath, this is the interpretation that was in the Isaiah reading today. On the Sabbath, we celebrate God's generosity. And on the Sabbath, we can rest in that generosity. We know that we don't need to struggle to earn on the Sabbath because we rest in God's goodness and generosity. And that means we can place our own agenda, our own needs, our own wants and desires, all of that stuff to one side. That means we don't have to go to work to make ends meet. We don't have to worry about going to work to make ends meet. But it also means that we can not only acknowledge God's generosity, but be generous. Be generous as God is generous. And so that's what he is doing. God is generous. Here is a daughter of Abraham, so that's an important saying. He is including her back into the community. And today, God is going to be generous and good to her, and we should celebrate that. So Sabbath wasn't about rule keeping. Sabbath was about living in the goodness and generosity of God. That's an important thing for us to remember. So I have some questions that come out of that, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about why I'm here in New Zealand. You don't have a clock, so I have no idea how long I've been gone. Sure bad. So one of the questions that comes out of this for me is, where is our poverty? Where is our poverty? Like, the poverty is clear in that story, but where is our poverty? What do we need to be released from? Who are we blind to in our midst? Who are the people who could be mustard seeds? Who are the people who could be the yeast in this community, and the wider community, if they were seen? What does proclaiming the year of the Lord's favour look like for us? Well, for you. I'm going home. For you. I'm here because I'm a Franciscan, like Ken. Ken was the past Minister General for the Episcopalian stroke Anglican. I know you have to use the word Anglican carefully in this country, but the rest of the world we're Anglicans, and that's a good thing. And we are a religious order. So apparently to be Minister General you need to be bald with a white beard. I don't know who's going to come next. There's no one in line. So we have 5 provinces: Europe, the Americas, so that's USA, but lots of the Americas, including Brazil and Guyana and Cuba, and Canada even. Africa, which lots of countries in Africa. Asia Pacific, which is Australia, Papua New Guinea, and up through Asia to Sri Lanka and Korea. South Korea, not North Korea, to be clear. And Pacific, which is New Zealand and Melanesia. So in each of those have a minister provincial, and we gather every 2 years. That's my job, is to call that meeting and to make sure that happens. So we were meeting at the Senegal Sisters down the road at Wantagh. Yeah, what he said. And it was beautiful. It was a lovely setting. We felt the prayers of the sisters holding us in prayer, and we had a really good meeting. So 2 of the big issues that were there for us during that meeting. One of them was climate change. It's a big meeting. It's a big issue. We had 12 years last year when the IPCC released its report to halve our carbon emissions. Otherwise, things are looking bleak. Bleak for our planet, bleak for us, really. The economic consequences of that are already being felt. They're being seriously felt by parts of my church in the Pacific, but they are being felt around the world, whether we like to see it or not. That's one of the things we're blind to. We can't see the effects of climate change a lot of the time. We can't see it happening around us, but we will see it, whether we want to or not. So we spent a lot of time talking about how do we as Franciscans and as Christians respond to that? What is it that we offer? So one of the things we offer is a means to repent, to actually... I read a book recently by an English priest called Dave Tomlinson, who's done some crazy stuff, like he had a church in a pub, and they had the beer while the church service was going on. Sounded like my kind of church, but I'm not going to try it in New Zealand. He talked about metanoia, the word we translate as repentance. He said that's really about a bigger mind. It's not about turning around, it's actually about getting a bigger mind, seeing the world and God in a completely different way. And that's what we need to offer people, a means of saying we have done poorly to our planet, we have treated it badly, and we need a bigger mind. We also offer a way of lament. The Psalms are full of psalms of lament, sorrow, wailing. Why is this happening? And that's a really important thing, because actually most of the time you can't change until you lament. Read the Psalms. They are full of psalms of lament. They're wonderful things. They're also full of psalms of anger. When you're angry, go to the Psalms. Oof, they're great. The other thing we offer in that getting a bigger mind is a different way of understanding our relationship to this planet. And I think that's something that we as Franciscans offer. That too often we see creation as something other than ourselves, and we have been given dominion over that, which means we can use creation for our well-being, for our economic good, without really having to worry what happens to creation. And the trouble is, when we do that, we can actually start treating people like that. And all of us have done that. We've treated people as if they're just there for our economic gain. I mean, we do it all the time. We buy cheap products made by people who work in very difficult environments, but that's good for us because we get it cheap. I do that. I'll own that. It's a struggle to not do that. So all of that is tied up together. And so what we're inviting people to say is that this world is our brother and sister. And that dominion, if we go back to the Hebrew, or rule, isn't about us using creation. It's about living in a way in which creation is, along with all the people who live in it, are able to flourish. Because the same passage, the same verses that talk about humanity being given dominion over the world in Genesis 1 also talks about us being made in the image of God. a creating and life-giving God. If we are made in the image of God, we are to join in God's creating and life-giving work, so that all of creation can flourish. Us, all people, and the world we live in, our brothers and sisters. The second thing we talked about was community, and that's linked to it. One of the things we talked about was, a lot of the time, like us Franciscans, who are kind of the same age group as the wider church, which in some parts of the world is a bit of a problem because we're all of an age, as the sisters said at the Cenacle. And we look around and we're getting older, and how do we get younger people? So then we kind of do drives to attract people, and I know lots of churches do that. And one of the people who was kind of along the side of that, comes from Long Island, actually said, "Why would anyone want to join us? What kind of community are we that people would want to join us?" And so, off his own bat, he's trying to create a community where people might want to join, where you look after each other, where you bring each other up and care for each other. He's a little crazy, but I really admire what he is doing. Like, he ran 76 people in one day just to see how they were going from the directory, and then just keeps doing it. But that's the basic question. If we want to be God's community, how do we live that out? Like, what kind of example do we offer in terms of how we look after each other, how we care for each other? Now, I don't know that much about you, and I'm sure that you're an amazing community and you look after everyone really well. The danger is when we take that for granted. When I was interviewed for my parish, I didn't really know whether I wanted it. I only put my name in because the bishop told me to. And I was obedient. I put my name in, I went, I don't really want this. And then they offered me an interview, and I went, I don't really want an interview, but okay, I'll come along. And they said, what would you do to do outreach for this parish? And I went, that's a stupid question. Why would you want to do outreach? Like, what is mission? Mission is when we engage with God and the work that God is already doing in the world. That's not outreach. That's just who we are. That's what we're supposed to be doing. Outreach is doing something so that people come to church. Why do we want to do that? Are we a Rotary Club? But actually, when we're engaged with God's work, with God in the world, helping to bring about the reign of God as described in Luke 4, well, then maybe people would want a piece of that and join us anyway. But first of all, before we can have any effect in the world, we've got to be joined in that work of God. And right now, that work of God, it's all about climate change. Because climate change is all about how we see each other and how we see the world we live in. If we start there, and God's work in that, I think we've got a good future. So, the 4 questions. Where is our poverty? Where is your poverty? Who are you blind to? Who are the mustard seeds? Who are the yeast in your community that you can't see? What do you need release from? And what does proclaiming the year of the Lord's favour mean for you? So I invite you to spend a moment sitting, going to take a risk. You can either talk to your neighbour for a moment or sit in quiet and think about those 4 questions. And then in a minute we will do whatever's next, which isn't what's next in our service, but I'll work it out. So either sit in silence or talk for a moment.